Cool. Awesome. So just like some housekeeping, folks, before we dive into the conversation. Thank you for joining. This would be like super interesting. I want to just sort of like, before we kick off, say a quick thank you to our friends over at More Happy. I'm going to just share a quick link in here before I forget, so that people can see that. We super lucky to be supported by the folks over at More Happy today. They are well worth a look at if you are interested in finding a method of manager development that is way more continuous as a coaching approach than one-off manager training. If you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. One hit, one-off training does not work. Many of us know that. More Happy are doing it very differently, and managers get access to on-demand coaches, over 100 ICF qualified coaches, so they can solve problems in the moment when it matters. So if you want to check them out, go say hi to Charlie. He's posted in chat there. Say hi, follow the link, and find out more about them. They are very cool, and they're doing some incredible work. Into the discussion we go. So just a quick bit of housekeeping before we do start off. You should all be on auto mute. If you do have a question during this session, please feel free to put something in chat, and we can pause, we can dive into that. I'll keep an eye on chat as well for you, Sarah. So if interesting stuff comes up along the way, we'll dive into that. This is a really important subject to a lot of people. I know that it touches all of us, it impacts us all, and it has done at some point, I'm sure, in very different ways. And yet most companies don't design for that. We get very cookie cutter, basic, minimal ways to deal with this. And so a lot of this conversation for me, I don't know about anyone else, but tends to focus on how many days off people get, which still isn't enough, by the way, in most places. But there are so many other ways you can build what Sarah would call grief-friendly cultures. And I'd never heard that term before, honestly, until we chatted, Sarah, but I loved it. And everything you were talking about got me super excited to do this chat, because bereavement goes way beyond time off. And there are so many other things that companies could be thinking about, designing, doing, implementing to help support people. So I'm super pleased you were here today. I'm going to pass over to you to do a bit of an intro and let everyone know who you are and why you're here. And over to you.
Great. Thanks, Adam. And I'm really excited to be here and share this with y'all today. While Adam pulls up the presentation, I also just want to take a second and commend everyone for showing up to a call like this. I think, which is reflective in some of the things y'all put in the chat. Grief policy is a thing that we don't touch on a lot in modern culture. And generally the topic of grief is something that people tend to really shy away from. So kudos to you all for taking time to dive into this topic, ask questions, be curious, and be open. Just showing up tells me that you guys are really on the forefront of wanting to create a different culture around grief and loss in not only your professional lives, but in your private lives. So I'm really honored that you would choose to share that time with me today. Adam, if you want to go ahead and pull up the deck, I can give a little bit of an intro. So today we are here. This is the Bereavement Beyond Policy, Practical Steps to Embed a Grief-Friendly Culture. Before we get into that, I just wanted to share a little bit of my background and my story. In 2024, I was caring for my mom as she underwent treatment for pancreatic cancer. And during that 8-month period, I was her full-time caregiver, working full-time, parenting a 2-year-old, and pregnant with my second son. I showed up to work every day. I took no days off during that time. And in February, my mom passed away, and I got 5 days of bereavement leave. When I came back to work after those 5 days of leave, not a single person at my 5,000 person company acknowledged my mom's passing. And that was when I realized that I could not stay in the corporate world as it existed, not because of the weight of grief itself, but because of the culture that surrounds grief in the workplace. And too often there is this false dichotomy between professionalism and personhood that I could no longer live within after experiencing this major life event. So I left my job to start Keriah Coaching and Consulting to help change that and really rewrite the culture of grief in the workplace. Before we get into it, and I've shared a little bit of my story, I'd love for folks to drop in the chat. Have you personally ever navigated grief in the workplace, either your own or helping somebody else? And you can say, like, scale of 1 to 5, how confident did you feel handling that situation? Where 1 is like, I was totally out of my depth, and 5 is like, knocked it out of the park. Adam, a 4, amazing. 4, amazing. 1, okay. 3, 4. 3, 4. Okay, lots of 3s and 4s. That's great. So what that's telling me is that we've handled it. We felt okay. Room for improvement, room to feel maybe more confident, more prepared, but people are feeling they have a little bit of legs to stand on, which is a great place to start. So let's talk a little bit about what bereavement leave looks like today before we get into what could it look like. Typical bereavement leave policies are anywhere from 1 to 5 days of paid leave if companies are offering paid leave. That is typically dependent on your relationship to the person who passed away. So often we will see policies that give 1 day for a certain relative group, 3 days for that next level of kin, and then 5 days for that immediate family, typically parent, sibling, child. We often don't see policies that include things like unconventional families, so people who have chosen family or who live with aunts, uncles, cousins. Pregnancy loss is often not included. Pet loss, you almost never see. And then the expectation is really after those 5 days, you come back to work, and that's it. Something interesting about bereavement leave policy is it really wasn't introduced culturally in the corporate world until the 1980s. And we are still 40 years later operating in those same frameworks that we did when it was first introduced in the 80s. But bereavement leave policy as it stands today is really not working. I am one example of that, but I am not the only one. 79% of people who experience a significant personal loss consider leaving their jobs after experiencing that life disruption. 83% of those people feel that their reputation at work was damaged because they were a griever. And 76% of people who lose somebody fear that they will be fired because they are grieving. So what that tells me, these are focused on the US, good question. So what that tells me is that culturally, we have a real problem around supporting people through grief and loss if people are afraid that their colleagues are thinking worse about them or worse, that their managers are going to fire them. And this problem is likely only to compound in the years to come. 67% of the workforce today, that's globally, is the sandwich generation. That's people who are caring for parents and children at the same time. This generation is twice as likely to experience a significant loss in any given year. And it's estimated that they will experience 5 significant losses over their professional careers. 1 in 4 people is estimated to be grieving at any given time in the workplace. And that's a very conservative estimate. And this level and magnitude of grief is costing organizations money. Conservatively, we think that it's costing organizations $75 billion in unaddressed grief due to things like lost productivity or lack of concentration. But when we really expand and we think about the whole experience of what it means to grieve, it's likely that organizations are losing $225 billion a year when we think about things like absenteeism, quiet quitting, taking time off for the physical manifestations of grief, and all of the ways that grief impacts not just your time at your computer. So what can we do about it? How can we rewrite this culture? How can we start making headway? Building a culture of psychological safety is the #1 predictor of high-performing teams. A study out of Harvard found that psychological safety is the #1 predictor. But psychological safety isn't just policy and isn't just culture. It's that intersection of where policy and culture sit to create that sense of safety in the workplace. And when it comes to grief, policy and culture really have to work together to create that psychological safety. So if anyone knows the poet Andrea Gibson actually passed away last year. They were the poet laureate of Colorado, an incredible poet, activist, speaker. And Andrea has this beautiful quote where they say, "We try so hard to do good, only to realize we should try softer. And I think this is such a beautiful framing to understand that we want to do the right thing. And sometimes that means taking a step back and taking a breath and being with the harder things and being in those soft moments. And so today I want to talk about softer and how we can show up softer in the workplace to create a culture of psychological safety around grief. So we're going to go through the 4 steps of softer. S is soften the landing. O is own the offering. F is facilitate connection. And T is toss the timeline. We're going to get into each of these 4 things. The first thing we want to talk about is soften the landing. If we take nothing else away from this talk, this is the place that I really want you to think about your organization and the way you've shown up and how you can begin to implement some of these strategies. So let's take the example of a new employee starting at your company. This person's never been to work before. They don't know what's going on. They're a little bit overwhelmed by probably everything. Ask yourself these questions. How often are you checking in with them? When you check in with them, is it about work, how they're acclimating to the role? Do they have any questions about the company? Is it all of those things? What kind of effort do you make to get to know them? What questions do you ask them? What do you want to know about their family, their personal lives, their history? What are the meetings they're participating in? How often are they participating, observing, getting the lay of the land, asking questions versus leading? And what's that ramping process for the first 30, 60, and 90 days that employee's at work? How are we orienting them and creating that soft landing for them at your company? Now imagine you have an employee who's just returned from a grief event. Our subconscious expectations are that this employee shows up after those 1, 3, or 5 days to a full schedule of meetings, 100% capacity working. They're back to their normal ways of working. So maybe that's 5 days a week in the office or whatever your normal ways of working are. They're back to normal and they maintain a positive attitude and they have good spirits ongoing. We don't say that, but that's sort of the expectation. Here's what that really looks like when someone comes back from loss. They have profound exhaustion. This leads to burnout. They can't work at that full capacity. Brain fog and distraction leads to a reduced capacity, self-doubt, insecurity. Anxiety about being in person makes it really stressful to come to the office. Then you have to deal with estate settlement, the administrative tasks of death and grief. Those can take weeks, months, hours in any given work week to manage while trying to juggle your full-time job. And then you're hiding that grief. You don't want your employees or your team to know that you're really struggling. And that makes you feel stressed and it doesn't make you feel safe in the workplace. This is where psychological safety immediately breaks down. So how can we change that? We want to soften the landing for employees who are coming back from leave. We want to treat that time entering back into the workforce as a re-ramping period. So we want to offer more frequent check-ins, both about work capacity, but also personal check-ins, time scheduled to specifically ask them, how are you doing in your life? We want to help outline what communication preferences that employee may have when they want to communicate around mental health, workload, and capacity planning. Are they at a time where they need to be off camera a little bit more? Do they want to communicate via Slack? Do they actually want to have a 15-minute check-in every day? Let's have that conversation, set the standard. What meetings does that person really need to be at in the beginning? And where can they take a little bit more time to ramp back up? And then this is the most important part, is we really want to outline what the goals, expectations, and accommodations are for those first 30, 60, and 90 days back in the office following a grief event. That can be anything from no camera days or half days to even bigger workplace implications like dismissing a performance review or delaying a performance review if that grief event happened right around that time. The next thing we want to think about is own the offering. I want to see a show of hands emoji drop in the chat. How many times have you said to someone who's going through a hard time, let me know if you need anything? Who said that? Yep, lots of thumbs up. Yep, everyone. It's so natural, right? Like, let me know if you need anything. I'd love to help. Now I'd love to see another show of hands. How many times has someone actually taken you up on that? Not as many. Right, thumbs down. Lots of crickets here. And that's because we're not giving people something to say yes to. We're making it really difficult for people to actually access the help we genuinely want to offer. So instead of saying something like, let me know if you need anything, I'd love to take something off your plate, or let me know if you need help with the paperwork, we need to make concrete offers that align two things. One, they make it easy to say yes. And two, they outline what exactly we are comfortable offering. So instead of those vague statements, we want to be specific and say something like, we'd love to set up a meal train to support you and your family if you're comfortable with that. I'm going to ask a member of our team to take over this part of this project for the next couple of weeks, if that's okay with you. Or I'm going to gather all the paperwork you need for this leave. Do you want me to text, call, or email it to you? These are really tangible offerings of support that give people something to react to and also give them the choice to say yes. So why this works? It's clear and actionable. It demonstrates exactly what level of support you're willing to offer. It makes saying yes easy, and it doesn't require additional work from the person who's grieving. So own the offering. That's O. F.
So,
yep.
Sarah, do you mind if I jump in? Just because there's a question in chat from Nadia, which like links to this a little bit. I think you're talking really well about like how we encourage people to take up that offer and say yes. And Nadia has made a great point around like some of the systems and like practices that might help people feel not the more safe saying yes to stuff, but maybe more proactively like disclosing like and asking for accommodations. It was a question that came up in my mind earlier, like, which I didn't ask, but I was thinking about like, why is this such a hard topic for people to talk about? It feels a bit taboo. And from a British point of view, there's like a stiff upper lip type approach. I don't know if that's goes globally as well, but there's like a bit of like a, we'll just get on with it and move on type thing when we get back to work. So like, unpacking Nadia's question a little bit, have you got any thoughts on that? I've got one or two things I could like share as well if helpful, but I thought I'd ask you first.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share something and I'd love to hear your perspective too, Adam. But so this is why we want to set these policies and accommodations up front. What part of the work that I help companies do is build what I call your beyond bereavement system. This is an appendix that lives with your employee handbook that outlines what all of those accommodations are, regardless of who you are in the company and what grief event you've suffered. So once someone experiences loss, you have basically a menu of options that you can offer them and say, as an organization, these are the things we're comfortable giving you. This is the amount of time we're comfortable offering it for. Let's work together for you to tell me what you need. So you can have that conversation up front so that hopefully we're avoiding performance issues. And again, that goes back to making it easier for someone to say yes by making those offerings really clear so that they can go through and say, yes, I want to work from home 1 extra day a week. Yes, I'd love to offload this one project, and I want no camera days. And I need that. And like, let's check back in a month. So we want to make it easier by outlining what those things are up front. And that's going to be based on your company and the policies you're willing to develop. But Adam, I'd love to hear any thoughts you have.
No, it's perfect. Like that's sort of what the thread I was going to pull out as well. And where I've seen this, or where I talk about this in a slightly different way, but I think it translates really, really nicely, is I talk to people a lot about like job applications. And this is a very different topic, I know, but I encourage companies to think about like, there's always a statement at the bottom of a job application that says, if you need any accommodations, or anything like that, let us know. And actually, a lot of people who need adjustments for interviews don't know that they need adjustments, or they don't know what adjustments they actually need. So if you could be proactive enough to say, actually, here's some examples of why folks might ask for adjustments and what that has previously looked like, it just helps people so much to realize, actually, maybe I should ask for that. Maybe I could get some help. And that was where I was thinking before you said, like, actually, that's a really smart thing to put in place, actually help people understand what they could ask for, and it makes it easier. And the only other thing, which feels a bit more of an obvious one as well, but has worked really well for me on a personal level, is if you can encourage manager, founder, whoever it is that's maybe like a bigger sort of presence in that business, to share any or open up themselves a little bit about personal grief and bereavement. Everyone's been through it at some point. Like, it opens up the opportunity for that person on the other side of the table to feel like they can talk to you about it, It's not easy to force that, but like it's worked well for me when I've initiated that conversation. So anyway, Nadia, I hope that helps. That could be an interesting one.
And Nadia, I'll offer one other like really tactical thing that anyone could do starting tomorrow is if you have an employee who goes out on leave, in the first month or 6 weeks that they're back, schedule one meeting a week with them that is just a personal check-in. This meeting is not to talk about work unless the employee wants to, but that's your opportunity to really gauge how is this person feeling? And then how could I, as the manager, think about ways to set them up for more success if they aren't comfortable asking for it. But at least then you get that really personal touch point to give them a space to say like, this week has been really hard, or next week I have to go do some estate planning stuff and I'm really, feeling nervous about it. You can start planting those seeds in your own mind so that you can sort of help guide them away from a place of it impacting performance by knowing what's going on for them personally. So I hope that helps. That's a great question. It also leads really nicely into F. F is facilitate connection. So I want you to notice the statements we tend to make when somebody returns to work or we see someone back in our personal lives after they've experienced a grief event. I'm sorry for your loss. We're glad you're back. Hate to see it, but you always get some version of everything happens for a reason. What I want you to notice about these things is that they are statements. These aren't questions. So we're not giving anyone the opportunity to respond to anything here. I want you to then think about, let's say you had a friend, colleague, coworker who just had a baby and they came back to work. What are some things we would say? What are some questions we would ask to people when they come back to work after having a baby? Drop them in the chat. As a mom of two, I can tell you a lot of people say, how's your sleep? Yeah. And the first answer is, how's your sleep? How was the birth? Sleep. We might say, what's the baby's name? Sorry for your loss. What's your baby's name? I'd love to see a picture. How is big brother, big sister adjusting to a new sibling? How are you feeling? So I want us to notice that these are questions, right? We're asking people questions. We're inviting them to share with us. Questions facilitate connection. Statements close the door. So when somebody comes back to work after experiencing loss, this is going to feel really uncomfortable for a lot of people because we're really not used to engaging in this way. But we want to ask questions. We want to give people the opportunity to share if they're comfortable. So instead of just saying, I'm sorry for your loss and moving on, you would say, I'm so sorry to hear about your mom. What was her name? Or I'm so sorry to hear about your mom. I remember when you told me XYZ story about her. I always think about that. How does it feel to be back in the office instead of telling someone, I'm glad you're back? They might not be glad to be back. So you want to give them permission to share with you how it's going. I'd love to learn more about your brother when you're ready. Is there a story you'd like to share with me? Yeah, I'm just seeing in the chat, Charlie saying it's probably too raw to ask questions about. And that is a real instinct. That's a real fear. And I think that's why we can leave it sort of open. Like, I'd love to hear a story when you're ready. Or, your mom or your brother sounded like a beautiful person. I'd love to learn more about them. And we just want to open the door. That's why questions facilitate connection, because it gives people the chance. So again, questions directly acknowledging the person who passed away help grievers feel seen. Open-ended questions remove the pressure to feel a certain way. And sharing about loss helps employees feel safe and seen. Again, that comes back to that culture of psychological safety. It's okay for me to talk about something hard here with you. And then the last letter of SOFT is T. We have toss the timeline. This is so important when we think about grief at work, because bereavement policies are really designed for a moment in time. Bereavement policies, if we're really honest, are death administrative time off. So what you're doing during that time is probably attending a funeral, maybe making end of life or estate plans, and handling those immediate tasks surrounding loss. This is not grief time. This is just the beginning. But often we think about support as just showing up in that moment. But that support is something people are going to need in different ways and places and stages over the course of the rest of their life. I can give you a really tangible example in my own life. My mom's 2-year anniversary of her passing is coming up in 2 weeks. I know that I need more support in these next 2 weeks than I likely needed in the previous 6. And that's because grief ebbs and flows. And having moment in time support is crucial. That's where we talk about that policy. But having a culture that can support grief in the workplace, that's where that timeline and that ability to support an employee through the rest of their grieving journey really shows up and becomes clear. So let's recap what soft is. We have S, soften the landing. This is really letting employees gently ease back into that workflow. You're not on bereavement leave and back at work, grieving, not grieving. We want to make it a smooth, soft landing for them. 2 is we want to own the offering. We want to offer clearly and proactively what we can give employees to help them have the accommodations and the space that they need to be a professional and also a person. F, we want to facilitate connection. We want to ask questions and hold space in a way that invites conversation and connection instead of just closing the door and moving on. And then T is toss the timeline. Know that it's never too early or too late to show up for an employee who's experienced loss. If you feel like you didn't get it right the first time, you can course correct and get it right later. You can always offer that support. And if you know someone's coming up on a hard time, it's never too early to jump in and say something. Because we know that work doesn't pause for grief. The business world is always going. The markets are going to open. We're going to have to hit deadlines. There's budgets to balance. But the other truth is that grief doesn't pause for work. You will always experience loss, whether you are at your desk or at your house, and you can't expect people to turn it off when they get to the door. So our job as HR leaders, culture setters, people managers is not to make grief go away. And I think once you understand that's not your job, it makes it a lot easier to know that our job is to just make it safe to grieve. So that's the soft method. That's the framework I use to think about grief in the workplace. I'd love to answer any questions, address anything that came up in the chat. If anyone wants to drop a question in now, or Adam, if there's anything that came up that you want to throw out there.
Yeah, I'm going to just give everyone a few minutes. If you've got a question, feel free to throw it in chat. We've tried passing the mic around before on here, and it doesn't always work as we hope. So if you've got a question, throw it in chat just to be safe. And whilst I'm just giving everyone a few minutes to do that, if you haven't got a question, there's been some really awesome examples that folks have shared. Thank you for sharing all these, by the way, folks. Some really cool examples of some really small but gestural type stuff that companies have done to help with some of that sort of broader timeline piece that you talked about, Sarah. So feel free to dive in and read some of that. I'm going to kick off with a bit of a question for you, Sarah, whilst we're sort of seeing if there's anything else that comes in. There's been some really interesting conversation in the chat around who does these check-ins, what questions do we ask, and also who does this come from? So my view is that this primarily has to be a manager role, not HR, but HR's role in this is to be the architect of what this journey, these touch points, what this approach looks like. How do you sort of see that balance between the two roles and the responsibility to each party?
Yeah, I just saw that question in the chat too, and I think that I 100% agree with that. It's not up to HR to jump in and sort of manufacture a connection with an employee that doesn't exist. This should definitely be coming from managers. The piece that I will add to that is that managers are going to need to be trained how to do this. You don't want to put a manager in who really doesn't know how to hold that kind of space and make sure that they can facilitate those connections and ask the right questions. And that's where manager training around grief and loss comes in and is so important. On the other side of that, it is also important for HR to have a presence there. From my own personal experience, I was shocked that nobody in HR said anything to me because in my mind, that's part of HR's job. But what HR can do if they don't feel comfortable stepping in is also make sure that you have some sort of acknowledgement policy as a company. So where or who in your company is responsible anytime someone submits for bereavement leave? Who is responsible for sending a note on behalf of the organization, maybe sending flowers? It doesn't really matter what that acknowledgement is, but somebody in a leadership role should be responsible for ensuring that that acknowledgement goes out, just so an employee knows that they don't have to hide it and that they don't have to then like report up the chain every person in the company that they've experienced this loss. Great question.
Awesome. Thank you. And we have got one or two coming in, but there was one earlier that Louise asked. I wanted to circle back up to that in case there's anything really like practical you can share. So Louise asked earlier on, what sort of questions could you ask in a personal check-in if you don't know them, rather than instead of just how are you getting on? My reply was, my thought initially was like, again, this is where the HR versus manager thing came on. And it's like, it probably should be someone who does know that person well, who's doing that check-in. But any advice you can give on like questions that maybe could be asked that could be good?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of ways to ask how are you doing that can get to different answers. So one thing you would want to ask is like, what's your capacity like this week? Which is a nice way of sort of saying, how are you without it just being, how are you? Another question I love to ask is what's taking up headspace for you right now? That really opens the door for someone being able to say, you know, I'm really distracted by what's going on with my family, or I'm just really actually focused on this work project and I'm not thinking much about my personal life. And then another one is what are you focused on right now is sort of the positive, another like a little bit more positive spin on that. So we really just want to ask people like, where is their brain going? And let them sort of guide that conversation. Because again, some people during that personal check-in will want to share really personal things and some people won't. But we want to ask questions in a way that opens the door for them to take it in either direction.
Awesome. There's a potentially different type of question coming in from Lisa. I don't know if this is something that you've dealt with before, Sarah, but when someone's maybe passed away at work, who's connected, is that like, I guess you're handling this in a slightly different way because you're not enacting a policy for someone here or like a journey, but this is more of a comms piece, and also like there is still a grieving piece, but for a wider group. So that's quite you want to navigate, I suppose.
So this is a really good question, and this is a really sensitive topic that has come up several times for me in my work. There are a couple of ways that I recommend that folks handle this. One, this is really where that menu of accommodations is super important because some people are going to want to dive back in and they're going to want to keep working. Some people are really going to need a lot more time and space, depending on your relationship with a colleague, how close you were with them. Sometimes just the proximity of death really rattles people in a way, even if they weren't close to the person. So we don't want to set an expectation that one person's grief is the right way to grieve. So typically you see a comms go out that say this person passed away, our condolences, here's our EAP benefit if anyone wants it. That's a great first step. But again, that when we think about own the offering, that's really putting a lot of pressure on an employee to tap into that resource when they might need support that looks a little bit different. So again, that's where I would get together with your leadership team and come up with what are the company-wide accommodations that we're willing to offer right now. Are we going to give people 3 additional days off to use at their discretion? Are we going to cancel work for the next 2 days? Are we going to hold weekly like visuals or memorial sessions for folks to join in? You want to define what those are and give people different touch points depending on the level of grief that they're feeling, knowing that everyone's going to show up a little bit differently.
Nice. Thank you for that. I know that's a very different type of question to navigate, so I appreciate that. Charlie, we've got a couple here. I'll let you read them, Sarah. But in case folks aren't on chat, Charlie's asked, which are the best examples of initiatives / activities / offers that you've seen from like some progressive orgs? Is there anything that sticks to mind or that you remember? I've got 1 or 2, but I might be able to contribute.
Yeah, so I'll offer a few, and then Adam, I'd love to know what some of yours are too. One is, this one's like pretty easy, but more progressive organizations are taking away that boundary of who they define as an acceptable person to grieve. That's really important. So instead of saying you get 3 days for this type of person or 5 days for this type of person, you say we have 5 days of compassionate leave. You can use them at your discretion. And then another one that I haven't seen a lot, but I would love to see is offering a flexible bereavement policy. So when we think about the way that more progressive organizations support maternity or parental leave, they'll say you have X number of weeks to use in the first year following a birth event. I think it would be so incredibly beneficial for employees to say you have X number of days to use in the first year following a major grief event, so that an employee can take off for death anniversaries or that person's birthday or just any time that grief is feeling really activated. They have time that they can use for that, because when you go back to that timeline slide, knowing that grief is going to come up at different times and people are going to need space. So those are two that are popping up for me, but Adam, I'd love to hear what you have.
Yeah, I'll share them in chat in a minute. But there's a couple that I just love, and I'm digging them out now. But just because they're short, they're simple, and very human. You could argue maybe they could be construed as like maybe vague to some people as well. So they're not perfect, but I love how remote do this. A lot of folks will be familiar with remote.com. I think they offer I'll have to double check this, but I think they offer 2 weeks full pay. And they're very clear about the fact that this covers it's to your discretion basically about who and how it is. It includes pets as well. So basically we are trusting you to make a call on how close you are to that individual or that pet that has passed away, and you get 2 weeks, no questions asked, etc. So from a time off perspective, that's a good one, but also a trust perspective. I really like how they word that. And another one that I love even more is a company called Send Technology, who we know, and they've got, again, I'll share this in a minute, but they basically don't have a set number of days. They basically just lead out with we hope you never have to go through this, but if you do, just know that we don't have a set number of days. Take whatever you need on full pay. Tell your manager, and we'll do what we can to support you during that time. It's a very short snippet, but there's some stuff like that which you read and you just it feels very human. And even though you don't have the detail there of what happens next, you still trust that this company will deal with it in the right way, if that makes sense.
And I would add one more piece to this, and this is kind of why I think this work is so important, is because what we talked about in the beginning, whatever policy you have is just one piece of this overall equation. And really being able to support culturally somebody who comes back to work is really where it's going to make a big difference in somebody's experience. Because, as we've seen in the chat, as we've talked about, everyone needs different things in their grief journey. Some people 3 days is fine. Some people 2 weeks is fine. Some people a year isn't enough. And so at some point, that person is going to come back to work, and knowing that they're coming back to an organization that knows how to talk about grief, support them, and relate to them is going to make a huge difference in their experience outside of whatever the policy stated.
Just sharing a couple of links there from Send and Remote for folks, so you can have a little dig through those as well. Just going to catch up with a couple of others. Diane's posted, not really a question, but experience of distress. Poor, he lost his dad. A month later, struggling.
I'm seeing a comment from Ruth that I'd love to address. So Ruth said, sometimes work is a welcome distraction. It's a safe space and break from all the feelings. How can you tell the team to support by not checking in too much? It just brings up the feelings. Again, I think this goes back to making sure you're having really clear conversations with that employee who's experienced loss. And then as a manager, you take on the responsibility of communicating that out to the rest of the team. So when you're checking in, you can ask that directly. Do you want to talk about this? Do you want to bring it up at work? Or you can just sort of let your gut be your guide. If every time you bring it up, they're shutting it down. But again, it's better to open the door because it's so often closed and then later close it than it is to just keep the door closed. And so much of this just comes back to consent and ownership and letting the person who's experienced loss guide their own journey and tell you what they want and need, because loss is such a destabilizing experience where so much becomes out of your control. The more control you can give back to a person is better.
Agree. And Sarah, I don't know if you do this or you've done this before or seen this done, but again, this sprung to my mind earlier. It might be a terrible idea, but who knows? I'll go with it. Just like, I mean, I made the point earlier that companies spend a lot of time mapping out onboarding, and building out these onboarding processes. Now, the difference there, I suppose, is that onboarding tends to be a lot more defined. People don't handle it differently. It's like you're in the system, you go through these steps. It's very easy to design. But you can map that journey out and look at what those like touch points look like even after someone lands. From a bereavement point of view, it still feels to me that there's an opportunity for companies to do a bit of an exercise around mapping out what this could look like. It's going to be different for everyone, but if you get enough voices involved, again, everyone's had experience with this. So there's cool opportunity, I think, for people to run like a bit of a workshop session of some sorts, map out like on a whiteboard or something like that, like all these touch points, all these moments that happen, and try and build your own like bereavement journey, if as it were. It's not going to be this like one journey that everyone follows, but like you said earlier, this got this great opportunity to then build this like very cool like manual almost. I can't remember what you called it earlier, but like this ability for people to say, right, a menu of stuff that like I should be aware of and I could be aware of as I'm returning to work. Like, if anyone out there's done that, but I think it's quite a cool idea if you haven't done it yet.
That is, Adam, thanks for bringing that up. That's exactly what I do. That's the work that my company does with organizations. So for anyone who's sitting there thinking, I'd love to do this, but I don't know how, or it feels overwhelming, or I'm sort of afraid of like stepping in something that I'm not comfortable or confident handling, that's what Keriah Coaching is designed to do, is to help organizations have those conversations, map out those touch points, and then build that beyond bereavement system that lives as an appendix to your employee handbook, so that when these moments come up, you've gone through the exercise and you have all of that mapped out.
Thank you. I genuinely did not know that. I thought it was a very clever idea there. I was building a business plan in the background.
Thank you so much.
I love it. Very, very cool, and how lucky. Very cool. So folks, I don't think we've had any more questions come in. Charlie, you just made like a really interesting point there, actually. If I like, and it is a really interesting point. Like, I've had this personally with unlimited holiday leave, and we've rolled it back to like set a very specific time frame on it. Have you come across this before, Sarah? Like, what's your gut feel?
Yeah, I didn't want to undermine you, Adam, but typically I discourage folks from saying take all the time you need, because we don't really mean it. If somebody needs 6 months, it's going to be really hard to offer 6 months full pay, come back to your job as you were. And that's why when we think about own the offering, we want to make really clear and specific offerings. So we want to say our policy is 5 days, take those 5 days. We're also going to give you another 2 weeks of compassion leave that you can use at any time. Or depending on the situation, we just want to give you a month. But we want to make that time really clear. You can always check back in and then reorient yourselves after that time. But that open-ended, take what time you need, we don't really mean it, and people don't know what that means. So, to Charlie's point, very similar to vacation, like you don't know what's the right level, and that feels really awkward.
Yeah, agree. And don't worry, you didn't undermine me. That's not my policy. So it's all good. I just like the language. But I think if you have designed the landing well and all the stuff that comes after leave, it's okay to not have the longest leave in the world as well, because actually if you are supporting that person through that return, then actually like that feels like it's the right approach. So we have one more question, and thank you for sharing. There's QR codes on screen if folks want to dive in a bit deeper or connect with Sarah. Donnie has asked, how have you seen the culture around the company be able to learn grief language to help these kinds of transitions?
Yeah. So I mean, training is obviously a big one. Another group of folks who I find really are interested in having this kind of support is ERGs. So if you have employee resource groups that are caregiver groups, parent groups, I've been at companies that have cancer support groups or loss groups, you know, being able to reach employees who you know are suffering is the first sort of line of defense. Also, that language is learned by modeling. So when you have policies that are open and accessible and really clear for folks, they're going to pick up on some of that language. But ultimately, this is the kind of training that managers can have. I have a slightly different framework to teach for individuals for how to ask for and advocate for different levels of support that they can feel comfortable doing when their organization hasn't really set those policy standards. But it just comes down to education.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you. Sorry, we peppered you with questions there, so appreciate it. Folks, thank you so much for A, asking so many questions, B, sharing so many examples of what your own companies do as well. There's some really awesome things in there, and we're going to try and pull them out where we can and put them into like an awesome takeaway doc that we can reshare with everyone after this as well. So sit tight on that. I will try and turn that around as fast as I can. Again, you can find Sarah on LinkedIn via that QR code, hopefully, and also a bit more about the work that she does as well. But I'm going to use that opportunity for like a natural pause here and save your voice, Sarah. Appreciate your time. And thank you everyone for coming and joining us and participating. And we will see you all next time.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.